Hello. Welcome. If anyone dares to come in the first row, we appreciate it. Come closer. So I'll proceed in English because the lecture will be in English too. So welcome to this lecture with A.A. Bronson as part of the Zurich Moves Festival, which started on Wednesday and is going on until Saturday with lots of performances, lectures, and occasions. A really amazing lineup. And thanks, Mark Streit, for the program. And thank you, Miko Museum, for Gegenwartskunst for hosting the lecture, and thanks especially Elena for organizing this. I'm Robert Steinberger, and I was asked by the Zurich Moves team to introduce A.A. Bronson and lead the discussion afterwards. We'll see if it was a good idea later. But yeah, please stay for the Q&A afterwards. So I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but my first encounter with A.A. Bronson wasn't in a museum or an art space or at a festival, but on Instagram. I know. I might be a child of my generation, but what's impressive that Bronson seems to be a child or father or both of many generations. And this intergenerational exchange is an important part of his practice, which we'll talk about later too. And it's become more and more important with time. Some of you might be familiar with his Instagram feed, pun intended. He posts pictures every day of his actual feet. Sometimes you see the rim of his striped pyjama trousers as well, and always with the same caption: "Time to start my day." I found this simple and honest gesture instantly moving when I saw it, because it's so refreshing and shamelessly human among the flow of high-gloss, happy imagery that we're accustomed to in our different feeds. His Instagram practice just touches the surface of his impressively large oeuvre, but it's still a great example, I think, of how he makes art as living and life as art. A.A. Bronson presented his first performance roughly 50 years ago in 1966. He was born in Vancouver and studied architecture in 1964, but dropped out after 2 years. He then found a free school and commune and an underground newspaper with the name Loving Couch Press. Really great name. As you will see, the independent publishing theme keeps popping up in his biography. In 1969, or depending on which foundation myth you believe, in 68 or 70, he formed the artist group General Idea with Felix Ports and Jorge Santo, all of which are artist names, by the way, including A.A. Bronson. They lived and worked together for 25 years. They did well over 100 solo shows, many more group shows, and again, they've also produced a magazine called File. This all led up to the foundation of Art Metropole in 1974, which was an art space, a distribution center, an archive for artists, books, videos, audio, and just a meeting point. As Bronson told me, we didn't like the art scene, so we made our own. General Idea pushed sexuality and queer content into the art discourse before anything close to queer studies was even offered at any university. And they made their being together a living artwork. This all accumulated to the Miss General Idea Pavilion in 1984, which was sort of their own museum, challenging the status quo of the art scene again. In 1987 to 1994, they focused their work on the subject of AIDS. In 1994, Felix Ports and Horizontal both died. Since then, A.A. Bronson continued to show work as a solo artist. Within that, he has had a 6-year stint as a director of printed matter in New York City, during which he made it viable again. It was actually close to closing. Within that, he founded the New York Art Book Fair, and he's also the founding director, or one of the founding directors of the LA Art Book Fair. He's taught at UCLA, at the University of Toronto, and Yale. The teaching, and as he calls it, being in the bookstore, made him part of a community again as in the 70s, or similar as in the 70s. But this time also as a mentor. He often collaborates with younger artists, which he'll also talk about. Also, his daytime job at Printed Matter allowed him to do private rituals and performances, which he's still doing until today, most recently in his performance series, The Invocation of Queer Spirits. All or most of these performances are always done without an audience and only with the participants. And he'll tell you more very soon, I promise. I want to close with a quote that when I was reading about Sophie Cull, remembered me of Mr. Bronson. It's from a novel by Paul Auster about where he describes the character based on Sophie Cull. But this activity didn't stem from a desire to make art, so much as to indulge her obsessions, to live her life precisely as she wanted to live it. Living always came first, and a number of her most time-consuming projects were done strictly for herself and never shown to anyone. So without further ado, A.A. Bronson.
Introduction. It was very difficult to get me to talk here. Mark had a tactic. He would ask me to come and speak, and then I would say no, and then he would wait a month and then ask me again. And I think he did that 5 times before I finally said yes. So I guess persistence pays off. And, you know, well, actually, I really love that quote you just read because it really captures a lot for me about my life and my work as an artist. And I have difficulty talking about performance because I can't quite figure out which aspect of what I do is the performance and which is something else. Because in a way, performance is involved in everything I do. And I think that's especially true because of my name, A.A. Bronson, which is not my real name. And when I took on the name A.A. Bronson, which was about 1970, I did so thinking, well, that's a name that I could inhabit. Like that person, A.A. Bronson, feels much easier in the world than I do. And I think if I'm A.A. Bronson, I can manage to get through life. Whereas Michael Timms was my real name, and I thought, if I'm Michael Timms, I'm never going to make it. So, this is, well, in this photograph, I'm 23. And so this is 1969. And I've already at that point dropped out. I studied architecture for 2 years, dropped out, started a commune, as Robert said, and ran a newspaper and a free school. And so at the age of 23, I also became a kind of expert in something that at the time was called radical education. And I traveled around a lot speaking at conferences about radical education. And I also apprenticed to a psychiatrist who specialized in intentional communities. And he would go from commune to commune doing group therapy for communes. And I traveled with him and learned a lot of techniques about how do groups work, and how can you make a group function, and how can you bring to the surface the problems that are simmering underneath the surface. So all of this came to fruition with the beginning of General Idea in 1969. And this photo is from about a month before General Idea started. What I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to go through a few images from those very early days, from the very early days of General Idea, from the 69 through to, I think I've got images up to about 72, only about 3 years worth. And then I'm going to skip to the end of General Idea, which means fast forwarding about 23, 24 years. And talk briefly about the deaths of my partners and how that led me into the work that I do now. So, it's interesting, you know, back then the word performance didn't really exist the way it does now. So, I did a series of self-portraits. This is just elastic thread. It's nothing very dangerous. And I don't know really whether I was doing a performance or whether I was producing a series of photographs, and the photographs were made into transparencies and light boxes, which became a kind of sculpture. So it's a kind of performance that went through a number of shifts and changes. And also when I look at this, I think, well, I was making sculpture in the first place. I was making sculpture out of my own body. So in these first images, I'm just trying to get a handle on where did I begin and how did I start. This is Felix from General Idea, and he was trained as a painter. This is also from 69, from our first year together. And he's taken strips of canvas and woven them. So, I mean, canvas is a woven material, so in a way this is a kind of macro picture of the canvas itself made out of canvas. And then when you pick it up, it kind of clings together, and then he throws it on the ground. And this has been also exhibited. I mean, it was a kind of action when it happened, and I think the most important thing was the kind of mind process and body process of doing it. And then it also became a photo sequence, a kind of documentation, which was typical of the period. And then it also became a kind of sculpture, because that wad of canvas also still gets exhibited today. I did really a lot of work with mirrors, and particularly with these convex, they're actually plastic mirrors, cheap convex plastic mirrors. And I tried to create kind of visual puzzles. There's no tricks, I mean, Photoshop didn't exist. There's no tricks, these are just photographs, but they're photographed in a way that makes them difficult to decipher, and they're kind of a mental puzzle. And I think of them in a way as a kind of self-portrait, but also the actual making of them, they're made lying on the floor, but the actual lying with the mirrors on my body and so on was also very performative, and was something to do with my identity at the time. And I think what it's really about is my lack of identity at the time, that I had no idea of who I was or what I was doing in the world. This is Jorge from General Idea, also from 69. And he's doing this kind of action where he ties together plastic bottles which he has filled with something, I don't actually remember what, and they get dragged through the sand on the beach. And again, this is relates to a lot of work that was going on at the time, particularly work out of California, both California and New York. Work that we now look back on and call performance. And at the time, this was, I mean, we didn't even know whether this was art or not art. It didn't really interest us when it was art. It was just, we amused ourselves by doing these kind of surreal actions to fill in our otherwise not very busy days, because none of us had jobs and we were all unemployed. It was a time in which it was possible to be unemployed, because one could live so cheaply. And we had our first studio. Our first year together was in a little house, but after that, our first studio had about 500 square meters. And I think it cost us something like $100 a month. And there were 7 of us living there. So what's that, $13 a month each or something. So life was very different back then. This is Jorge, again, with the same bottles. But now the bottles have had labels put on them that say Jorge's belly food. And they're a kind of fake product. The first house we lived in together was a storefront, an empty storefront. And we began doing fake shops. And the shops would always have, the door would always have a little sign that said, back in 5 minutes. So this belly food store was open for a month, but we didn't sell any belly food. And thank God, because they're worth a lot more money now than they were then. But it was the beginnings, I think, of our interest in consumerism and consumption and the whole structure of the Western world as a kind of buying and selling machine. Another example of a project from the period called Manipulating the Self. And we sent this one's rather water damaged, but it's the only one I've got left. We sent these invitations out in the mail asking people to photograph themselves in this position, because in this position you are both the subject and the object. You are held and you are being held. And it kind of messes up the whole concept of an artwork and an art world. And many, many people sent us photographs back. This is just one sample. We used one of them on the cover of our magazine File. So this is the second issue of File, which started in '72. And we used File as a kind of way to describe our world, our art world that was different than the other art world. And we made it look like Life magazine because we thought if it looked familiar, then people would pick it up and look at it. So we thought of ourselves as a kind of parasite culture, that File could be in the newsstands of the world and people would actually buy it, not because I knew anything about it, just out of familiarity. And in fact, that was pretty true, that Life magazine took us to court over that. We published a little book with the same Manipulating the Self. We did a lot of books over the 25 years we were together, and this is just an example. And I think it's kind of typical of the kind of publishing that's going on in the art world today. You know, if you go to the I Never Read fair in Basel, or the New York Art Book Fair in New York. Yes, there's somebody there now trying that gesture. And the thing about that gesture is also you can't, if you ask yourself, am I doing the holding or am I being held? It's like your brain synapses get messed up. And we made it print. So in all of these very early projects, you can always see there's a kind of performative aspect that's bleeding off into other media, into photographs, into documentation, into books, and so on and so forth. This is something called the Orgasm Energy Chart. And it started out, we sent this out, we sent out about 200 of them in the mail. So it was kind of a mail art project. asking people to document their orgasms for 1 month, which days they had them and exactly what moments they had them. And I would say that most of the ones that we got back were falsified. I can't believe they were true. But what I did was, this is my own, the one on the left is for January, 70, 71? And then I tried to reproduce exactly the same orgasms exactly 1 year later. So the following January, I had to plan my time so that I could have orgasms at the correct moment, which was very difficult. There was something called the Underwear Project, which never really got too far. It's still in our archive, and I still don't know quite what to do with it. So this is Felix in his underwear. And then Jorge insisted on being photographed in a girdle. And that's like a project waiting to happen, but unfortunately it never will. What happened was a big kind of mega project from '71. It took place in many locations, in many forums. This is all in the city of Toronto. We were given the lobby of a theater and asked to participate as part of an experimental theater festival. And there were many famous theater groups there, like Theater of the Ridiculous and so on and so forth. And what we did was we took a text by Gertrude Stein called What Happened, and we began by sitting on the stage and just reading it. This was too radical for this entire experimental audience. The audience was very angry because all we were doing was reading the text. But we videotaped that anger. And then in the lobby for the following 2 weeks, we did a series of actions of various sorts. We did actions out of the street, and we collected videos, photographs, and we did performances also in the space. And it's too big a job to describe it to you, but photos like this, which Jorge would print in the darkroom every night, would be put up on the wall the following day with a little line of text. And the text is made with a telex machine, which seemed very modern at the time. There's our telex machine. And we had sent out also messages to people like the Anything Company, if anybody's heard of that, different artists in different cities and different countries, asking them to telex the text of what happened back to us. So every now and then in the middle of the day, the machine would suddenly start up, and out would come the text of what happened coming from a different source. It was a kind of chaotic environment. And we also held our first Miss General Idea Pageant as part of the, I won't even try to explain what it's all about. And we did projects like this, where we had friends of General Idea carrying out very simple actions which we documented and added to this wall of documentation. So in a way it was just a kind of description of our own lives. But in a way it was a description of our lives as we wished it were as well. This is me, 1971. As I remember it, I was just sitting in the kitchen, and suddenly Felix and Jorge started putting things on my head and on my body and laughing crazily, and then took this photograph, which ended up being featured in File magazine. And I think what they were trying to do was make me into a sort of shaman. So this is my shaman portrait from '71. And also in '71 we did another beauty pageant, the 1971 Miss General Idea Pageant. And this is a kind of fake beauty pageant. I'm going to go ahead to this. We had these 13 very ugly dresses left over from another project we did, and we decided to make them the General Idea gown. And we sent them with an entry kit. The front is the artist's conception of what Miss General Idea should look like. We sent them to 16 artists, And we asked each of them to send their proposal for Miss General Idea wearing the gown. So that part of it was kind of a mail art project. Here's the acceptance form that each entrant had to fill out. And this is an example of the kind of entries we got. This is from Vincent Trazov in Vancouver, and it's a photograph of Michael Morris. We then had a juried event where a real art jury was put together to judge the entries in a gallery space. So in a way it was real, in a way it wasn't very real. And then once the winners were chosen, we had an awards ceremony at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which was then in the form of a performance. So it was kind of like a beauty pageant, but it was a beauty pageant in which only certain moments were included and the rest of it was omitted. So for example, the most important moment was, "May I have the envelope, please?" And the audience were told that they were actually the television audience, because beauty pageants in North America only really exist as television events. So the audience was also portraying a role and was given instructions, you know, when to applaud, when to stand up, when to sit down. So the audience, like a television audience, was a kind of fake audience. So that's just a little window into the first 3 years, actually 3 years out of 25. And then if we fast forward to 94, 93, 94, Jorge and we had at that point been doing work completely on the subject of AIDS for 7 years. And Jorge and Felix were both diagnosed in 89 and 90. And this is a self-portrait we made in 93 as 3 doctors listening to each other's hearts. So again, this is an image which is kind of performative, but it's not really a performance, it's a self-portrait, but it became many things. It was a book cover, it was a photo work, it got turned into a billboard, and so on and so forth. So Jorge and Felix both died at home in 94. It was obviously a traumatic year. But in a way it was fantastic because we could work together, we could continue to collaborate up until the end. So Felix continued working until about a week before he died, and Jorge continued until really about 3 days before he died. And that was a great gift for them to not be in the hospital. And then I couldn't, I knew that I had to be then an individual artist, and I didn't really know how to do that. And this is the only piece I made during the first 5 years. I think this came out after 3 years. And it's a kind of general idea work. It's you know, 3 empty chairs, and I call it Untitled for General Idea. And it's a kind of like non-performance work. I think I included this because it's like the impossibility of performance. It's 3 empty chairs, and it's not only that Felix and Jorge had died, but also that the part of me that was with them in General Idea was also gone. I was no longer General Idea. This is a portrait of Jorge exactly a week before he died. He was blind at this time, and he asked me to take these photos, and this was definitely a kind of performance because he had trouble standing, and he didn't know, like he kept saying, okay, are my eyes open enough? Should I close them a little? Should I open them more? He was trying to look, you know, kind of realistic, like his eyes should look normal. And these photos were made into posters which I put on the streets of Vienna in the first solo exhibition I had, which was at the Vienna Secession in 99, I think it was. And this is a photo I took of Felix on his deathbed. And as Felix came closer to dying, he surrounded himself with more and more color and pattern. And this is how his friends visited him, and this is how how he was when his friends sat with the body for 24 hours before we let him be removed. And again, I made this for an exhibition in Munich in '99. I took this photo at the time he died, 3 hours after he died. The reason his eyes are open is because there wasn't enough flesh left to close them. He just kind of wasted away. And I knew that I wanted to do something in public space with this image because we had lived together this kind of semi-fictional public life and a kind of performative life. We played the part of General Idea, and I wanted to put this image out into the world. And I had the chance for an exhibition in '99 called the Dream City in Munich. It was a collaborative project between several museums, and we made this billboard and we put it in 5 locations on the Ring Road and a 6th copy in a museum. And then I had to do the equivalent for myself. This was made for the Vienna Secession. It's a kind of coffin with my own image on top. And it was like a prop for a performance that never happened. Because when I had my first show at the Vienna Secession, I thought, I'm not going to be able to cope with this. All 3 death portraits were in there. And so in a way, I made this a box to hide in. I thought, I'm going to lie inside the coffin during the opening and play the part of the dead AA. But somehow I managed to get through the opening without having to do that. So again, it's like a performance that didn't happen. And that's the image on the top, and it's based on the image. There was a period in the late Renaissance in northern Germany where portraits on the sarcophagi were made with people naked, with the body beginning to rot, with worms coming out of the eyes and so on. And I based my self-portrait on that. Now, through the whole period where Jorge and Felix were sick, I had been going to California and taking courses on being a healer, whatever that might mean. And after they died, I realized that I'd actually been very good at it, that they were able to die at home because of the skills that I had. And I thought, well, maybe I should do volunteer work in a hospice or something like that, but I was really, frankly, too burned out for that. And after about, let me see, in about 98 or 99, I got an announcement from the school where I had studied, saying they were having a kind of refresher course for healers, for professional healers. And I was not a professional healer, but I applied and I got in. And I took the course, and I realized, okay, I'm one of the best people here. I could be teaching this. I should do this professionally. And especially since at that time I had really no income. I wasn't selling any art. General Idea wasn't selling. I had no money. So I came back to New York, where I was living then, and I found 3 people who would allow me to do healing sessions with them once a week for 6 months. And I did that. And at the end of 6 months, I had enough self-confidence to announce, to let people know that I was now taking clients. And somehow this happened very, very quickly. Bot magazine got hold of that information and did an infamous interview with me that appears in all their books almost immediately, and I was inundated with customers. I was working 40 hours a week as a healer, which is not a good idea. It's much too much to deal with. Very quickly I kind of collapsed from the kind of psychic weight of too much from too many people. This is an exhibition I did at John Connolly Presents in New York, and I turned the gallery into a kind of spa. Because this healer, this healer identity really kind of stuck to me. It was like, okay, suddenly everybody thinks I'm a healer. Instead of General Idea, I should make that part of my art identity. So I made this environment in which I could give people healing sessions. And there's a massage table. And the idea was that I would give a healing session every morning before the gallery opened, every night after the gallery closed, and some sort of energy would build up in the space. So these were, in a way, private performances. It was performances that were not open to the public, but the public could come in between the performances and feel whatever energy might be in the air. And I did a kind of performance, a real performance, in which I didn't actually demonstrate on someone, but I talked about the process of being a healer and why I did it and what it was about. He was a fake client. Well, somehow I didn't feel very satisfied with that. It's like, wasn't really the right way to work in the gallery situation. And the New School invited me to do some sort of project, anything I wanted. So I said, how about if we do a poster and we put it around the school, and I offered 10 free healing sessions to the first 10 people, and then we'll do a public discussion about what happened. And Greg Bordowitz, who maybe some of you know is an artist and writer who wrote a lot about AIDS, he was my first client, and the idea was that he and I would have a conversation at the New School about the whole project. And the one thing that these clients, these 10 clients, had to agree to was that I could take a photograph before and after. Just a head and shoulder shot. So here's an example of a before and after shot. Not much difference. In fact, some people think it's the same photo twice. And it's remarkable, really, how little difference there is before and after these sessions. So we had the public discussion, and again, at the end of it, I felt like, in a way, nothing had happened. I didn't know how to incorporate the healer thing into my art, and I wasn't finding any really satisfactory ways. They were all they were interesting to explore, but I felt in a way like this. I felt suspended, and this I realized after I did this piece that in fact it's the image from the tarot card called the Hanged Man, and the Hanged Man in the tarot card signifies that you're in a place where something's going on under the surface, something's cooking, but there's nothing you can do about it. Give up, stop trying. So this was my self-portrait in that moment. And a hint for anybody who wants to try bondage, only use cotton rope. This was nylon rope. It's extremely painful. This is a collaboration that I did with Terence Coe. I started to do a lot of collaborations with younger people. I guess collaboration's just in my blood after doing it for 25 years. And, oh, by the way, I'm not going to talk about books much. The Museum of Sex in New York, which is a really weird museum, the Museum of Sex invited a bunch of artists to be in a show. And I said to Terence, who was a friend of mine, let's do some sort of collaboration. So we came up with this idea to do a kind of double toilet cubicle. And in a way, it's a kind of invitation to perform. Performance is implicit in the piece. The doors lock, and there's a glory hole inside. There's photographs taken from a kind of punk queer zine on one side, and a book of provocative photographs on the other side, and the doors lock, and you can go in there and do whatever you want. I did once, on a Tumblr blog, see a photo of a hard-on coming through that hole, so I know that somebody used it for something during the time it was exhibited. But mostly the men, and especially the gay men, stayed well away from it, like they refused to go inside. And all the women wanted to have a look. I was at a residency in the Canadian Rockies in the mountains. What year would this be? 2007 maybe? And it was about 20 people, residency with about 20 people, and I was brought in as a visiting artist. And of the entire group, of the group of 20, only one was identified as queer, and the others were most definitely straight. It's like the straightest artist residency I have ever seen. And so this poor guy, his name was Peter Hobbs, was desperate to dream up some sort of queer ritual or something to relieve the straightness of the event. And the Banff Center, which was the host of the residency, gave me this little cabin in the woods to do. They thought I could go and write in there or whatever. But we used it, we did a little performance. Banff was a very peculiar place. It was traditionally a place where the First Nations peoples, the Native peoples, didn't allow themselves to live there because it was a sacred place. It was a spiritual place. And they would gather there once a year. The men only, no women were allowed, and would gather there for some sort of spiritual gathering, which I haven't been able to find too much about. And many artists being sensitive people, many artists report massive headaches, all sort of physical problems, the kind of problems that come traditionally from in presence of spirits, of spirit life. It's also a place which was first developed by the railway companies. When the railways came through, there was this incredibly gorgeous location, and the railway companies built two very fancy hotels there, this in the 1800s, and started advertising it as a destination for tourists. And the whole hospitality industry was all men, and the whole railway industry was also built entirely on men. And then there was a little bit of leftover history of trappers and people like this, again, an all-male society. And then the logging business, also an all-male society. So there were all these layers of all-male societies in this strange place, including, first of all, the native peoples who had this all-male spiritual gatherings here. So Peter and I sat, it was kind of cold, so we sat inside the cabin. I would have liked to do it outside. We developed a ritual that then I repeated many times in many places after that. It consisted of a kind of invocation, a kind of text, where we invited the spirits of these many marginalized communities, of these communities that we tend to forget existed. We invited them to join us in the room, any that were still lingering around, had been unable to go to the other side. And then we had a bottle of whiskey, and we passed it back and forth, and we had a conversation. And in a way, I wish I had recorded that conversation, but also the others in other places, because it really was like a voice came out of our mouths. It was like these passionate monologues. You know, Peter would speak for 5 minutes, then I would speak for 5 minutes. It was the most peculiar experience, and it felt, while we were doing it, just really like we were just talking to each other. And then at a certain moment it quieted down, and we realized it was over, and we realized there was actually something much more going on than we even realized. So that was the first of a series of performances that I called Invocation of the Queer Spirits. And the thing I really like about it is that there's no audience, it's just the people who are involved. And there's no documentation. As soon as you start to introduce documentation, the whole thing closes down. And so, you know, living in New York, which is all about the marketplace, selling things, I got so sick of the art world. This was a way of doing performance and making art in a way that didn't engage with the art world in the normal way. This is another location. This is an abandoned store in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg's in the center of Canada. It's the coldest city in North America. And it's also the city with the largest Indian population. And it has, it was originally a fort for trappers where furs were traded, and also a military base. So again, it begin to get these collisions of different all-male societies that build up. And it's also a very interesting city for artists, and especially for queer artists, especially for film. And so in this location, I brought together about 6 local people to do this invocation in this abandoned store. The abandoned store is at a key juncture in the geography of the city. It's next, immediately adjacent, actually on the left, to an avenue of trees, and every tree has the name of somebody who died in World War I on a little plaque on the tree. So it's on Memorial Avenue, which is already a memorial to the dead. And it's a store which for years sold old military equipment and also stuff from trappers, like furs, a lot of furs. So it has this history implicit in the place. And there we found this roll of white fabric in the basement, and we wrapped it around 4 columns. And so we created this space for ourselves in the middle of the store. And, and for this performance, this was our costume. We're always naked in all these performances, but this is where I developed the idea of a butt plug with rooster feathers. And the thing about the butt plug is, if there's going to be any kind of spirit, if the spirit world is going to try and be troublesome and try to move into your body, there are ways to avoid that, and the butt plug really does it. It keeps you like rooted in reality. It's like, you can also just like put a mint on your tongue. If you feel spirit possession coming on, a mint on your tongue will bring you back to reality and the spirit will move out. This is my equivalent of the mint on the tongue. And it's also, it's startlingly bird-like when you have this thing in, and you know, you can't take yourself seriously, everybody's laughing. And so there's a kind of, it's like nobody can be doing some sort of fake, you know, I'm a person who knows a lot about this kind of thing. It brings everybody down to an equal level. Everybody becomes completely silly. And at that level, then you really can begin to do this thing. So we do the invocation, this time for a different group of people, marginalized communities. And again, there was the whiskey going around. This time it lasted till 2 in the morning, which was started, I think, at 9 at night. So it lasted 5 hours, which is rather long for these speeches to come out of our mouths. And when it was over, we were exhausted. But I made this image of myself into a series of silkscreen prints with diamond dust on the surface. And this is a show I did at Vit to Vit. And here I've put sage on the floor. So when the audience comes in, their feet crushes the sage and releases the smell. And also kind of sage dust comes up into the air. So the audience is put in the position of being kind of the performer at the same time. A third one. This is, Robert, do you want to keep track of time and warn me if I'm going like really longer than I should? This is Governor's Island, which is just outside of New York. It's a short ferry ride from Wall Street. And again, it's an island, it predates New York City. It was a place where the native peoples never lived for some reason. They went there to gather berries, but they refused to live there. I don't know why. It was a military base starting in, I think, the early 1700s. Then they built a prison there, so it was an all-male prison for a very long time. And then in the late 1800s, when there began to be epidemics of yellow fever and so on, the dead were all buried on this island as well. So it's really an enormous graveyard. And it's now been developed into a public park. And I was invited, in order to try to get this public park going, they invited artists to do projects on the island. There's houses. This was a military officer's house, and I proposed to do one of my queer spirits gatherings because, of course, being it was essentially an island of the dead. I thought, what better place to do an invocation of the queer spirits? And what we did was there was an entrance lobby, and we made walls that closed off the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, which became our space to work in. And we made these glory holes, in fact, so that the audience, not during the performance, but once it was over, the audience could look in and see what remained. And this is an idea of what they saw. So there's, well, I won't even say, I mean, it was quite a wild event, this one. And it took about 7 hours. They started getting longer and longer. And actually, we were all kind of delirious. I mean, I think it was 9 in the morning before we ended up going back to Manhattan. And you know, there's no ferries at night, so the parks people had arranged a special ferry to take us back because we thought we'd be finished by 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. But in fact, by the time we were finished, the public ferry had started, so it was completely unnecessary. This is Elijah Berger, a painter from Chicago, now living in Berlin, actually. And there was a queer residency on Fire Island one summer when I was there. And I was a kind of visiting artist, as it were, living almost next door to the residency. And Elijah was one of the residents. And Elijah works with sigils. So a sigil, for those who don't know, is a kind of magical emblem. It's made by taking an idea, like a sentence, and removing the vowels, taking the consonants and collapsing them into some sort of graphic image. And I don't actually remember what this one said. And the way that you the sigil, what you're supposed to do then, is once you have the sigil on a piece of paper, comes out of you know, the Aleister Crowley and so on, that kind of tradition of magic, European magic. You're supposed to write it on a piece of paper, visualize it in your head, burn the piece of paper, and then, it's always men for some reason, you're supposed to ejaculate as you visualize it. So it is a kind of performance too. So here we are making our sigil. And then that was used as the carpet, as it were, on which I did another invocation of the queer spirits in Berlin at the Esther Schipper Gallery. And then during the course of the exhibition, the remains were on display for the public to see. But frankly, that wasn't very satisfying. Somehow doing an invocation of queer spirits in a gallery space is like the worst place to do it. It didn't suit it at all. Did a series, this is again on Fire Island. Now Fire Island was a famous gay resort starting in about the 50s. And there were two communities. Well, Fire Island is a long sandbar just off of Long Island, very narrow. There's no cars allowed, and there are little communities with wilderness between them. And 2 of those communities are the gay communities, the Pines and Cherry Grove. And the Pines is more like designers and fashion designers and I don't know, stylists, and it's the kind of place that certain kinds of writers might go. It's very Tony. It has, you know, beautiful houses in the sand dunes. And then Cherry Grove is kind of like bears and leather daddies and drag queens, and it's like the working class version, although it's rather expensive. And both of them they hate each other, they absolutely hate each other until after midnight. And then after midnight they meet in this wilderness that's in the, for sex of course, in the, between the two communities. And in the 80s, many men who were sick and dying of AIDS, because I mean everybody who had AIDS was dying of AIDS, many men came to spend their last days in this beautiful little piece of land. And then they would go back to New York to die, and then many of them asked that their ashes be spread in this woods. So it's a woods full of the ashes of the dead. You to cry. So I did a whole series of performances around this idea of the dead that inhabit this forest, and I'm not really sure why I painted myself red. I think it's because getting older and being in an aging body, I feel invisible, and especially in Fire Island, which is full of beautiful men, I have become invisible in my old age, so I thought, okay, I'll paint myself red, I won't be invisible anymore. And we did a series of, this was a collaboration with a young artist named Ryan Brewer, and we did this portrait in the woods, which also exists as a light box. But for me, it was really an action. It was really to paint myself red and to go out in public. I had to walk through the town on the boardwalks in the daytime, past people to get to it. And Fire Island's the kind of place where you can do that. It was a very transformative experience. And this is a similar, that's Ryan, again the same young artist, that's Ryan on the left, and then my husband Mark in the middle and me on the right. And we did this, I wanted to do something similar, but I wanted to do it in the middle of winter when only the spirits are on the island and there are no people there. And so this was done in February. There was no snow, but it was cold. And this is another, kind of meditation on this same theme of remembering all the people whose ashes inhabit this island. This is a collaboration with an artist from San Francisco named, and now I'm going to really forget his name. What is his name? I'm really terrible with names, but anyway, I know it perfectly well. So what we did was we put down a big piece of canvas. In a way, we were creating a painting. It's a little bit like a sigil painting. We had a kind of graphite dust, which this artist worked with a lot. And we walked in a circle, and we put this canvas in a place where I call it a hot spot. It's a spot where a lot of sex has gone on for 60 or 70 years. And we walked in a circle, meditating on the dead on Fire Island in this woods, and putting graphite dust in front of our feet as we went. And so our feet were kind of pounding down the graphite dust. It got extremely dense. And he had also mixed graphite dust with some sort of lube. And we did the same thing as one does for the sigils. We ejaculated into the circle as kind of the climax, literally, of meditating on the dead. And then we sat and we talked about it. We both cried. It was, and I don't know, is this, well, it was a performance. There was one or two audience because people would come in to see what was going on and then go run out again. I exhibited, this is the result on the wall at Witte Wit in Rotterdam, where I did an exhibition. And here I've got Kathy, okay, Mia names. Kathy, I should have written down all the names in advance. Kathy is a lesbian theologian who writes a highly radical queer theology. and she gave a lecture about queer theology, standing in front of this painting, let's call it. And then I also invited Ron Athey to do a performance in the same space as well. And again, there's the sage on the floor, and Ron did a performance based on The Maids by Jean Genet. So all of these things have different kind of tendrils and different lives and connect to other artists and go on to become other things. I'm showing this image, and this you probably know is the famous Freud's room in London where he gave his healing sessions, I call them. So using that as a kind of inspiration, I was invited to do a performance at the Stedelijk Museum, and I created this tent, again as a collaboration with a young weaver, and Travis Meinhof, and I call this the Tent for Healing, and I sat in there for a number of days, and people could make appointments to come in and see me, and the subject was healing. And I had no idea what would happen. I was prepared to give healings if necessary, but also to receive healings, or also just to talk about the project. And I had an assistant in there with me, a naked assistant, kind of my geisha girl a little bit, Richard John Jones. And Richard was kind of the icebreaker. Somebody would come in and discover they were in the room with a good-looking naked young man. And Richard would make tea for us and kind of get everybody relaxed and get the conversation started while I lay on my own kind of Freudian divan in this special robe made for the event, and I would talk to whoever came in. And it took many different forms. So I think the most moving one for me was a young Korean artist, actually not so young, in his 30s, who lived in London. And he came and he said the reason he'd come was to tell me that he was HIV positive, because being Korean, and Korean is so homophobic, he couldn't tell his family, he couldn't tell his friends in London in case it somehow got back to his family, so he couldn't tell anybody at all that he was HIV positive. So he came and he told me. And often that was the case, that what the healing consisted of was just somebody wanting to tell me something that they couldn't tell anybody else. So that was interesting to me. It meant these healings could be sometimes extremely short, quite unexpected. Oh, this is another performance. This is with Elijah and Ryan both. This was called Who's Afraid of Red, White, and Black? And I won't try and explain, but it's another kind of invocation of the queer spirits, this time in New York City. I was asked by the School of Visual Arts in New York to be kind of the official mentor, because obviously I totally got into mentoring a whole crew of younger artists. I was asked to be the official mentor for an artist named Bradford Kessler, and I agreed. And the weird thing, to me it was weird, about Bradford was that he identified as straight. And I thought, well, why does a straight artist want me as their mentor? But he was very interested in a lot of the same topics, and he devised this project, which again takes a number of forms. It exists primarily as a film, and I wanted to show that today, but it jams up my computer. My computer can't run it. It's too big a file for my computer, unfortunately. But it's The Prodigal Son. It's based on the Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. And the film consists of him naked, kneeling on the ground, facing the camera, and there's a voice from off camera, my voice, as the father, asking him the kinds of questions that fathers always ask, like, you know, why are you such a failure? Those kinds of good fatherly questions. And to every question he answered, I don't know. And each time he said, I don't know, pile of colored glop would come down on his head. And in the end, the glop is animated to rise out of the ground and becomes me. And he embraces me. So he becomes the prodigal son who is welcomed back by the father figure. I gather he must have issues with his father. But I love this piece, and it's always it escapes me a little bit always. And it also exists as a large light box. This is a painting by T.M. Davy of me in the what I call the magic forest, this forest on Fire Island. And I've used it a number of times as a kind of signature piece to go with exhibitions around this, the theme of Fire Island and the spirits of the dead. This is the Gwangju Biennale in Korea. How many?
8:15.
8:15? Okay, and what time did we start? 7:15? Okay, I'll hurry up, I'm near the end. This is, I was invited to be in the Gwangju Biennale, and they knew about all these things I've been doing. And there's a building on the grounds, it's a, what do you call it? What do you call this building? My brain is dead. Pagoda. Say that again? Pagoda. It's a pagoda. It's a 3-story pagoda. And it's been sitting there for a very long time and never used. And they thought, well, AA is the one who could finally use the pagoda for something. So I was given a little 3-story building to do whatever I wanted with. And this is my costume I wore for the Gwangju Biennale, made of very Canadian moose horns and quartz. These light boxes of these various images I've already been showing you were exhibited in the space, together with, again, I put this time mugwort on the floor. Now, Gwangju, I mean, Korea is an interesting place because the original religion of Korea is, in fact, shamanism, which has always interested me a lot. And it was outlawed in 1895 by the Japanese when they took over Korea, but it still exists. And although most of the population is probably Christian, still, if you get a new apartment, you get the shaman to come in and bless it. You know, the shamanism is very much part of the kind of domestic life of South and North Korea. So I tried to key into that. So I used mugwort, which is, it's also being used a lot in Germanic countries for witchcraft and also in Britain. But all the older women who came in would go, as they walked in the door. This is in London at Marine Paley, an installation I did called Treehouse. Again, there's this kind of tent enclosure, and again, I'm spreading the mugwort as a kind of performance. And it's a kind of performance in which I engage with the audience. I usually do it before the audience comes to the opening, and then during the first half of the opening, and then I just chat with people as it's going. So it's not intended to be like the audience is over there and I'm over here, but it becomes an excuse for a conversation. And I think this is about the end. I also did this performance, it's kind of like a nod to Joseph Beuys, because I think Joseph Beuys was a big influence on me in the late 60s and early 70s, is just sweeping the sidewalk outside of the gallery. And I spent about an hour just very carefully sweeping the entire sidewalk around the gallery. And then the broom was put on display in a vitrine inside. And it's about taking care. It's about, and again, I was available to talk to as I was doing it. Oh, one last project. These are photos of a publication, but it's a publication which documents the making of a series of paintings that I did with Keith Bowlby. We did these in Salzburg. Keith is known for having developed this technique of squirting paint out his asshole. And I suggested to him that we do a collaboration And this is the publication that documents it. And the paintings, in case anybody's on their way to Munich, are up now at the Deborah Shimoni gallery. So again, there's this funny interaction of performance becomes, you know, photographs, it becomes a book, it becomes paintings, it goes through a different kind of life, and those are the final paintings. And I'll finish with, this is the last image, and it's an invocation of the queer spirits that never truly happened. There's a very small island off the coast of Ireland with a monastery on it, and it was abandoned in 800. No, it was started, it was built in 800 and abandoned in 1200. I guess a Catholic monastery, all male. All the animals on the island were male, and the climate was just too harsh, and the monks finally gave up and came back to the mainland. And we made an attempt to go out to that island. Basically it's the tip of a mountain coming out of the water. It's just completely vertical, and there's 600 steps going up to the top. And on the top are these little beehives made of stone, and the monks would each sit, one in each beehive, and meditate. And that's where we wanted to do our invocation of the queer spirits, and the weather would not let us. We hung out there for a week, and even helicopters couldn't get to the island. The climate turned so violent. So this is we did a little invocation on the mainland just to feel better, because it's the one that got away that we weren't able to do. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your life. If anyone ever has a question, please, there's an extra microphone that Alena is going to give around. So we're very happy about it.
I have to sort of apologize, because I felt like I should come up with some more, something to say about performance itself. And in the end, all I could do was give examples without coming to any conclusions whatsoever. So maybe it's a talk about failure.
Or we can try to figure that out now. Because actually what interests me is this struggle of yours to translate, as you said, or incorporate the healing part of your practice or the rituals into a gallery setting or art space setting. And you showed a little bit of the development where you first were more literal about it, right? And set up a spa and all that. And I found, just seeing the examples, even though I didn't see them live, when you started just showing, select the photographs and the stage, and it was very, the essence of it. It evoked or invoked the spirit of the performance. So maybe you can talk about how you came to that point of just choosing those photographs, for example, the self-portrait as the butt plug, feather butt plug. Because I found that was an example where it worked. Or
I'm not sure whether I have an answer. Well, I guess, you know, because of having lived and worked with General Idea for 25 years, and we produced at a phenomenal rate, just sort of like our artwork kind of poured out of us. And once that was over, and once I started my own practice, it was like, there were kind of expectations out there in the world. So I am in this very lucky position of having people invite me to do things. Invite me to do exhibitions, invite me to do projects or performances, and each time I'm invited to do an exhibition, I have to think, well, what have I got that I can actually exhibit? You know, it's like, I have trouble thinking what I could exhibit. And so I tend to grab at what I'm working on at that time and transform it into something that can stand in for the real experience. So this photo with the butt plug becomes a kind of emblem or icon that stands in for that whole series, for example. But I have to say it comes out of being in this very privileged position of being offered exhibitions and not actually being, I'm never actually at any moment working on artwork as these people think I am. You know, like if they want to do a studio visit, there's nothing to see.
But you said when you first did those, like the spa and that kind of work, you weren't satisfied and it kind of drained you. Do you feel more satisfied now, the way you show the work now?
Yes, well the thing I've been mostly doing more recently is these quite large collaborative projects where I involve a dozen other artists. And then trying to work in a way that becomes a metaphor for something else. I know it's kind of hard, like without showing photos, it's hard to describe, but I guess trying to work with other artists to create an environment in which something happens for the people who go through it. Because I had an exhibition recently in the Kunstverein in Graz and also in Salzburg, and then somewhat earlier at Witte de Witte in Rotterdam, and all three of those were these kind of elaborate collaborative projects with quite a bit of my own work, but a lot of collaborations with other artists, and then also solo work by those same artists that somehow knits together into something more complicated or more complex anyway. I'm finding that to be satisfying.
Again, collaborating, basically. Are there any questions from the audience?
I was telling Robert that Zurich has the quietest, I predicted, accurately probably, Zurich has the quietest audience because I have talked here on a number of occasions, and the Zurich audience is the quietest that I've ever encountered. So I challenge you to ask a question.
Beat the cliche.
Or maybe somebody could explain why that is, why the Zurich audience doesn't like to say anything.
I have a question. Thank you very much for this beautiful speech. So I was wondering about if you could say anything about the relation between like these separatistic forms you were looking for, or you found these only male places in relation to queerness. Just because for myself, I always find separatistic form as somehow empowering in a way.
Say that again, say the last part again. You find?
For me, separatistic formats were always a tool, interesting one.
Well, that's, I mean, the women's movement and the history of the women's movement is so full of that kind of thing, right? But I've found a lot of women very aggressively angry about my performances where they're not allowed to participate. And it's funny because I haven't really ever said you can't participate. I just never really, You know, I've always said that people who identify, well, the way I put it was people who identify as male can participate. And then I had one trans person in one of them. Well, one of the last ones that I did had a straight guy, one straight guy who had wanted to participate, and he was very uncomfortable. And although he did the whole thing with the butt plug and everything. And one person who identified as trans, and he was fine, and he expected to be uncomfortable. So that was kind of an interesting experiment. And in a way, I would prefer to do something that's more inclusive, but it's just this project came out of that weird history of that one town in the Rocky Mountains, and it led to exploring, especially in North America, there are all these histories of these male populations that before there were any women outside of native populations, you know, there were hundreds of years where there were only men, basically. And it's very interesting. I did one in New Orleans as well, and in New Orleans there's a complication because you know, it was Spanish, it was French, it was British, it went through different histories, and it was basically a swamp. It was a deadly kind of place. People just died there. And it had these strange populations. There was a community of pirates that lived in there. The pirate ships were safe in that bay just outside New Orleans. And there were the slave traders, there were the slaves, and there was never any slave. There weren't really slaves in New Orleans, although it was a major, major slave market. All the black people who were there were usually free, or they could work. There was a tradition in New Orleans that if they worked on, kind of like working on weekends, they could, if they worked enough hours, they could earn their freedom. So it was a real place of freedom. But then the weird thing was that France, in the, I can't remember the date now, but at a certain point, France emptied their prisons of women and sent half of the women to New Orleans, and it was basically witches and prostitutes. And you can feel this in the history of New Orleans. It's really a city of witches and prostitutes. And the other half they sent to Eastern Canada, to the area especially around Montreal. And frankly, you can feel it there as well. And so there's this very interesting female history comes into play as well in some places. But North America is pretty weird for gender stuff.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you'd want to say something about the afterlife of your works. Do I need the microphone?
Yes.
Okay. If you could say something about the afterlife of your works, because they start off as performances and they arrive at us through photography or light boxes or a slideshow. And I was wondering if any queer spirit inhabits the final product that you show us, or if...
I wish I could say yes, but I don't think so. I don't think not the same way, because the performances themselves are, you know, it's a very physical experience and kind of impossible to describe. And I tried, especially at the Vit to Vit show, I tried to create some of that presence there, using things like the sage, and we also did an invocation in the museum. You know, Rotterdam's really interesting because it was the biggest slave trade in the world came out of Rotterdam. It's got an amazing history that's been totally submerged and hidden. It's a fascinating place to do this. But it just didn't take somehow in the museum context. You know, that white cube can kill anything. Yeah.
Anyone want to prove us wrong? I keep trying to form this question right, but I don't know. I'm just going to try because I'm still interested. and it's obviously a sensitive topic, the time period when your partners died, and how you transition through that to be able to make your work. And you showed those 3 portraits. But maybe you can also tell us more about the chairs and maybe how.
Well, because we've worked together for 25 years, we really become like a single person. It's kind of like an old married couple, you know. Jorge always read the movie reviews. So once Jorge died, I didn't know which movies to go to anymore. And when you're with somebody for a very long time, those very strange things happen. So I don't go to movies still. You know, they've been dead for 20 years and I still don't go to movies. And there are many things like that. It's kind of like having your arms and legs chopped off. So I had to kind of invent a new self who could, a self that wasn't there before, that could then make art. And that was an extremely difficult thing to do. It's kind of hard to talk about because I'm not even sure that I can talk about it because it's kind of, it escapes me as I try to get a grasp on it. It kind of slithers away. You know, what was it actually that happened? I'm still not totally sure. It certainly strengthened me to have gone through that. Oh, there is another weird thing. For the first maybe 2 years, you know, I was having to deal with the General Idea estate, with all the work that we produced together. And obviously, once they died, we couldn't produce any new work anymore because we weren't a group anymore. And I'm still minding the General Idea estate. And Felix, in particular, always was very opinionated about what should happen to everything and how everything should be done. Jorge didn't care so much. And so in the 2 years approximately that followed their death, if I found myself doing something that Felix didn't like, I would get this big, like a kick in the right buttock. I mean, really literally, like somebody kicked me. So like that, and I think, oh yeah, Felix doesn't like that. And then I would change to something that Felix did like. So in a way it was like, I realized at a certain point that I was still collaborating with them on some level, that we were so interconnected as people that even though they had died, their presence was still there and still informing what I did at some level. And I don't know how to explain that, you know, if that's something about spirit life, is it just about my psychology? You know, my doctor was seriously worried and sent me to a psychiatrist. But it was also got me through that period was that I could feel their physical presence. I had their assistance in getting through that period until I figured out how I was living my life. So I'm kind of grateful to them for that. That's the real answer, I think.
I would like to know what the future projects, if there are any future projects, and what they are or what they look like and where they are.
Yeah, it's funny question to ask right now because I don't think I have any future projects of my own at all. There's, and I felt, you know what, I just did these 2 exhibitions in, when was that, October, in Salzburg and Graz, which were on simultaneously, called, doesn't matter what they're called, I won't remember anyway. And at the end of them, I felt so depleted, like, I just feel like I don't have another ounce of creativity left in me. And I haven't had an idea since.
Collaboration? A new collaboration?
Yeah, maybe I need a new collaboration. But the big project that is on the books is a retrospective of General Idea, which will go through Latin America. And as part of that, they're producing the catalog raisonné, which has over 2,000 works in it. So it's this gigantic mega project. Weirdly enough, going to Mexico City and Buenos Aires and nowhere else, but that's mostly what's using up my time these days.
Quite a lot, I assume.
Quite a lot.
Quite a lot of time.
Yeah, quite a lot of time. The thing I've been quietly thinking about in the back of my head is to write a autobiography. I think that might be interesting to do. So, might try my hand at being a writer.
Next reinvention. And then back there.
It's actually quite a simple question. I wanted to know if you could say something about your beard.
About my beard?
About your beard.
Well,
we've seen you like in almost every position, but somehow your chin was never in the picture.
Well, I think my beard was part of that transition after they died. It was like, I did have a beard occasionally when I was younger, but it never lasted very long. And I always kind of had the feeling I should have one. And my great-grandfather was a missionary to the Blackfoot Indians in North America. And he had a huge beard. And I have this portrait of him painted by an artist who's known for doing portraits of Indian chiefs, basically. But anyway, he painted my great-grandfather. And I always imagined that I would one day have that beard. So when Jorge and Felix died, there was a certain point where I just started growing the beard. And as the beard grew out, I became the person who was after General Idea. That's somehow part of my transition into another phase of my life. And that's what it mostly is for me. I like the sort of signification of wisdom and that kind of thing going. I'm not adverse to it.
Another question? Two other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if there was ever like moments where you can kind of step back from this figure of A.A. Bronson and, I don't know, be the person that you were before you started with this whole art thing. And if you could imagine like stopping doing the art and become someone else again.
Well, my mother always claimed that I announced I was going to be an artist when I was 3. So it was always there in me, but yes, that other self is still there, but it's become somehow a very small part of me. But it's still present, and it's still a kind of guiding voice in some way. I don't know why, but I still feel that shy little boy. That shy little boy is still there in the center, you know. And I'm aware of protecting him too. Protecting I don't know, I always think of time, you know, time supposedly as the past, the present, and the future are simultaneous, and that's kind of how I feel about myself, that the part of me, you know, the part of me that was with General Idea and the part of me that was a small boy are still with me now, and we all kind of share this body.
You were talking about the white cube, but you seem very critical about the art world, and with the invocation you're doing, is it a way to tell something about a younger generation?
Well,
what would you say?
When you look at the history of how art has been exhibited, it's kind of like in the 50s some point where the concept of the white cube suddenly gels. Before that, I mean, if you look at, God, what's her name who had the Surrealist Gallery in New York, famous person, who has the foundation in Venice, who's that?
Peggy Guggenheim.
Peggy Guggenheim. So Peggy Guggenheim had a commercial gallery in New York. and it was designed by Duchamp, something like that. It's a totally eccentric space. It's a fantastic space. There's no hint of white cube to it at all. But in a way, it was just like a better example. There were many galleries that took many different forms at that time, and the white cube wasn't the kind of ever-present thing that it became in the 60s. And I miss all those other forms. You know, I find the white cube is supposed to be neutral, but I don't find it neutral in the slightest. Maybe it's also partially comes from that time when religion, well, Christianity became out of balance at about the same time. So, for example, Dan Flavin, his pieces were originally they all had the same title. They were icon number 1, icon number 2, etc. He conceived of them as religious pieces. And after his first show in the early to mid-50s, there was a really strong review in the New York Times criticizing him for the religious content. And then from then on, all his works were called Untitled. And when you look back historically, you know, you can see, I mean, Buddhism is fine today, but not Christianity. You can see there's a point that religion dominates culture and art up to a certain point, and then becomes more just a fabric of it, and then the art world completely rejects religion and spirituality. And there are still artists hiding it in their work, but it's very much, you know, verboten. And that's the same point where the white cube comes. It's kind of odd. I always feel like there's some relationship between the two, but I don't know what it is. And now, of course, Dan Flavin's work always gets shown in kind of ultra-white cubes. But when he was originally doing his installations, he was playing with architecture. He made pieces for specific locations to play with the architecture in specific ways. Now they're dealt with as if they're works that have no relationship to their environment. Anyway, it's an interesting subject, and nobody's really, I think the white cube and this thing about spirituality are interrelated, but I don't know what it is. And I dislike both aspects. I dislike the white cube, and I dislike that spirituality is being ejected from the art world. In fact, I had a curator from Chicago once say to me, this was about 20 years ago, but she said, we were at a dinner sitting next to each other, and I mean, I don't actually consider myself Christian, but she made this pronouncement, you know, if you're a Christian, you can't be an artist. The two don't go together. I thought that was very interesting.
With the general idea you set out, basically to create your own art world, or the opposite of that. Do you feel like you inhabit that now? Or?
No, not really. I mean, could be nice to have a gallery for a while.
Next project.
Next project.
All right, I think we'll close it. Is there any last questions? Then I thank you all for coming, and thank A.A. Bronson for... And there's also a performance happening at Tom's house now, I think, but after overnight, you can sleep over. Thank you.
Thank you.